During our episode on Richard Varick, we got a glimpse into a logistics officer's mundane, but nevertheless essential job. By all accounts, Varick did well providing for the troops under his charge. But not all quartermasters of the Continental Army were as ethical as Varick. While the first Quartermaster General of the Continental Army, Thomas Mifflin, tried his best to supply the men, he also helped enrich his fellow merchants by providing them insider information on what supplies the army needed. He also ensured they were awarded several lucrative contracts. Through his life, we're going to take a look at corruption, war profiteering, and political wrangling among the elite of the new United States. Welcome to America's Forgotten Founders, where we will look at people whose contributions to the American Revolution, whether on the battlefield, in the halls of power, or on the home front, have been all but forgotten by the annals of history. Thomas Mifflin was born into a wealthy and powerful Quaker family in Philadelphia on January 10, 1744. His father, John Mifflin, was one of the city's premier merchants. John Mifflin was also quite active in local politics, serving as a city alderman, as a trustee of the College of Philadelphia, and as a member of the Governor's Council. We know little about Thomas's early life, but it seems he attended a Quaker grammar school before eventually attending the College of Philadelphia. While he received a somewhat traditional education, learning basic Greek and Latin, he was also introduced to the ideas of the Enlightenment. His notebook from the spring of 1759 detailed his thoughts on the nature of just and despotic power, that power alone is just, which is adapted to the public good. Other powers, though, granted by the rash deed of an ignorant people, has no right. He also wrote, the very notion of civil life or polity is opposite to despotism of the power of masters over slaves. While he undoubtedly developed the foundation of his later political philosophy during his time at college, we should still be careful about drawing a direct line from the school books of a teenager to the principles of a revolutionary statesman and general. We should also be wary assuming that these reflections imply a desire for democracy. Although Mifflin would later spearhead resistance activity throughout Pennsylvania, he was no democratic reformer. Although he did oppose British policies, he was firmly against granting the commoners a voice in government. After graduating from the College of Philadelphia in May 1760 at the age of 16, he began his apprenticeship under William Coleman, an acquaintance of his father's. For the next 4 years, he served Coleman faithfully, learning the mercantile trade from one of Philadelphia's best. His apprenticeship completed, the wealthy 20-year-old opted to take a year-long trip to Europe. While the trip was ostensibly about forging business ties overseas, it was more of a vacation than anything else. Mifflin spent most of his time in France, learning to ride a horse and learning to speak French. When he returned home in 1765, he founded a new store alongside his brother George. The two were quite successful, quickly climbing the social ladder of Philadelphia. No longer did Thomas need to rely on the wealth and patronage of his father, he could stand alone. The wealthy young merchant ultimately married his second cousin, Sarah Morris, on March 4, 1767. Our sources seem to diverge on exactly how many children the couple had, with some claiming just one, named Emily. A book published, though, in 1911 claimed the Mifflins had 4 daughters. Mifflin was also making other inroads into high society, being elected to the American Philosophical Society in February 1768. Through this society, he was introduced to prominent men such as Benjamin Franklin, John Dickinson, and Owen Biddle. Thomas Mifflin's career in public service began in earnest on March 9, 1771, when he was elected to serve as a warden of Philadelphia. Think of this job as the organizer of a community watch. The following year, he was elected to the Pennsylvania General Assembly. As Mifflin leisured about in Philadelphia and Boston over the next few years, he quickly became a prominent critic of British policies. He argued against the hasty adoption of a non-importation agreement, the call of many early revolutionaries, instead arguing that all 13 colonies must take united action. As events, though, began to spiral out of control, Mifflin played a central role in trying to coax the people of Pennsylvania towards resistance, especially after the Boston Port Act of 1774. To the merchants of Philadelphia, such a policy set a dangerous precedent. As the Pennsylvanians demurred further action, Mifflin was appointed to Pennsylvania's Committee of Correspondence in May 1774. On July 22nd, Mifflin was chosen as Philadelphia's representative to the First Continental Congress. As the rest of the Congress's members arrived, they often gathered at the Mifflin residence to discuss politics. Not only did the men discuss politics, they also regularly feasted and drank late into the night. One of those often in attendance was a Virginian colonel named George Washington. As the First Continental Congress finally convened, many delegates pushed back against an economic boycott. John Adams, who supported a boycott, described the young Mifflin at these early meetings as a sprightly and spirited speaker. At Congress, Mifflin was one of 3 men assigned to craft a non-importation agreement. After much deliberation, the final draft of this agreement would pass on October 18th. Shortly after the First Continental Congress disbanded in the fall of 1774, Mifflin was re-elected to the Pennsylvania General Assembly. On December 10th, the Assembly would become the first body to ratify the non-importation agreement drafted by Congress, primarily due to the efforts of Mifflin and John Dickinson. The Assembly would later reject a petition by Governor Penn to write a letter airing their grievances to King George, claiming that doing so without the consent of the other colonies was a betrayal. As soon as Philadelphia received news of the Battle of Lexington and Concord, over 8,000 people gathered to listen to several speakers, one of whom was Mifflin. He concluded his speech with a powerful call to arms. Let us not be bold in declarations and afterwards cold in action. Let not the patriotic feelings of today be forgotten tomorrow, nor have it said of Philadelphia that she passed noble resolutions, slept upon them, and afterwards neglected them. We should recognize that this speech was not a declaration of war. It was, though, a plea for self-defense. He quickly followed his own call and joined the militia, being commissioned a major. For his willingness to bear arms, he was expelled, though, from the Religious Society of Friends on July 28, 1775. When the Second Continental Congress convened on May 10, 1775, Mifflin would be one of Pennsylvania's delegates. He wouldn't remain long, however, for the newly appointed Commander-in-Chief, George Washington, who had become friends with Mifflin during the First Continental Congress, asked him to serve as his aide. Mifflin readily agreed, departing with Washington on June 23, 1775, for Boston. Despite the 2 men getting along well enough, Washington quickly decided that Major Mifflin, who had 0 experience as a soldier, but plenty as a merchant, would make an excellent quartermaster. On August 14, 1775, Mifflin reluctantly accepted the post. While plenty of merchants were Continental Army officers, Washington chose Mifflin because he felt he was trustworthy. Writing to Continental Congress delegate Richard Henry Lee, he described Mifflin as a man of integrity. Washington hoped Mifflin would neither participate in nor condone the embezzlement of funds. While Mifflin was certainly a gentleman of integrity and did not engage in outright embezzlement, he did give his fellow Philadelphian merchants preferential treatment. Writing to one of them after he was appointed quartermaster, he blankly told him, "In my opinion, you never had a better chance to do business." At the same time, though, he impressed on them all to keep detailed records of all transactions, pointing out that the commissions to his friends and partners will probably excite the jealousy of many, so take care to give no cause of complaint. He advised a fellow Philadelphia merchant, Matthew Irwin, that particular merchandise, if bought soon, would fetch a good price. But being a man of integrity, he still advised Irwin to keep this letter entirely to yourself. Rumors of corruption and profiteering quickly reached Washington, who wrote to a friend on March 25, 1776, "I have taken occasion to hint to a certain gentleman in this camp, without introducing names, my apprehensions of his being concerned in trade. He protests most solemnly that he is not, directly nor indirectly, and derives no other profit than the Congress allows him for facilitating transactions, 5% on the goods purchased." The man Washington alluded to certainly wouldn't be the only quartermaster of the Continental Army accused of corruption. And technically, Mifflin wasn't lying. He wasn't profiting himself, although his business partners were. He also wasn't profiting indirectly, since he had stepped away from his own mercantile career. Nonetheless, I find it hard to believe that Mifflin didn't expect these favors to be generously repaid in kind at a future date. In all fairness to Mifflin, it's important to note that war profiteering has existed as long as humans have waged war, and it will likely exist for as long as we continue to kill one another. If it hadn't been Mifflin, it would have been someone else. Washington himself, by the way, wasn't above making a quick buck when the opportunity arose. When the Continental Army sought to decommission 100 horses that were deemed too worn out for military service, Washington wanted to purchase them at a low price and send them to Mount Vernon. The commander-in-chief wrote to Mifflin to facilitate the purchase in March 1777 to keep his name out of the question, as the most innocent and upright actions still are often misconstrued. Mifflin's contemporaries were well aware of the profiteering going on. In letters written shortly after the war, a former Continental Congressman from South Carolina, Dr. David Ramsey, painfully recounted the effect of war profiteering on the new United States. A spirit of money-making had eaten up our patriotism. Our morals were more depreciated than our currency. This spirit of money-making didn't harm Mifflin. He was quickly promoted to colonel for his work as quartermaster. Around the same time Mifflin helped Washington conduct the most innocent of transactions, he was stationed in New York City, helping provide the troops with lodging, food, weapons, entrenching tools, and the like. To reward him for his services in strengthening the defenses of New York City, Mifflin was promoted to Brigadier General on May 16, 1776. This promotion, while ostensibly granted for his conduct, was also motivated, in the words of John Adams, because he was a gentleman of family and fortune in this country. Such a man must be kept happy indeed. Shortly afterward, Thomas resigned as quartermaster, being granted a field command on June 29, 1776. Despite strengthening his post, the men disliked serving under the young general, thinking he thought too highly of himself. And they probably were right. Nonetheless, all the work done by the men would be for naught. The British landed in a different section entirely of the American line, and by the time Mifflin and his men arrived, the Battle of Long Island was over. Brigadier General Mifflin and his men were among the last to withdraw from the defeat. After Long Island, Mifflin's replacement as quartermaster, Colonel Moylan, resigned. Washington convinced Mifflin to resume the post again until a suitable replacement could be found. Reluctantly once again, Mifflin agreed to Washington's request. After the Continental Army was forced to give up New York City and all of New Jersey, Mifflin spent time preparing the militia of Philadelphia for battle. He soon led the militia out, joining the Continental Army in time for the battles of Trenton and Princeton. Due to his service, he was quickly promoted again to Major General. At the same time, he resumed his duties as quartermaster when the army encamped near Morristown, New Jersey, at a place called Valley Forge. The following year saw Mifflin dodge accusations of corruption while he tried to implement the logistical system demanded by Congress. He had failed to complete these reforms by the time Philadelphia fell to the British on September 26, 1777. Despondent about losing his home to the enemy, and angry that he had not received a field command, and in ill health, Mifflin resigned as quartermaster on November 7, 1777. Washington, who had once praised Mifflin, quickly changed his tune, as he was forced to act not only as commander-in-chief now, but also quartermaster. Mifflin felt unappreciated by his former commander, and Washington began questioning the job Mifflin had done as quartermaster. The once cordial relationship between the two men quickly soured. It only spiraled further as Mifflin quarreled with General Nathanael Greene, Washington's new second-in-command. As Mifflin, Washington, and Greene stewed, the Continental Congress, languishing in York after the fall of Philadelphia, grew restless. Many blamed Washington for the fall of Philadelphia and disliked his vision of a standing professional army. The Congress appointed Mifflin to the War Board, a body to oversee military affairs, the same day he resigned as quartermaster. To these men, already angered at Washington, Mifflin aired his disgust not necessarily with Washington himself, but at men who instead had an undue influence over him. As Washington lost Philadelphia, Major General Gates won the battles of Saratoga. Gates's star was rising, and Washington's was falling. We need to remember that Washington wasn't yet established as the hero of the American Revolution or the father of the United States. He was still a fallible man who had both his admirers and detractors, his friends and enemies. At this time, Mifflin loosely aligned himself with General Gates and General Conway, forming the Conway Cabal. Now, we've touched on the details of this affair in our James Wilkinson video, so we won't go into too much detail here. All we'll do now is point out that the Cabal was never really an organized force in either the Continental Army or in Congress that crystallized into a larger movement. Nobody ever formally requested that Washington be replaced as commander-in-chief. And let's remember that Congress was well within its right to replace Washington as commander-in-chief. Washington knew this too, writing in May 1778, "The moment Congress, not that of faction, calls upon me to resign, I shall do it with as much pleasure as ever the weary traveler retired to rest." Nonetheless, as we know, the backroom machinations of Gates, Conway, Mifflin, and others got exposed. The hammer of justice, or retribution, struck some men harder than others. While Gates merely had his ambitions for further power curbed, Conway was shot in the mouth during a duel fought over this affair, resigned his commission, and fled to France. For Mifflin, whose complicity in the affair was never conclusively proven, but had been attested to by Henry Laurens, the president of the Continental Congress, his son John Laurens, General Cadwalader, Peter Stephan de Ponceau, Baron von Steuben's secretary, among others, the result was a somewhat temporary stain on his record, dealing with even further accusations of corruption from his time as quartermaster. He resigned from the War Board in February 1779. Though the Conway Cabal affair had damaged his reputation, Thomas quickly regained his footing. On November 12, 1782, Thomas Mifflin was appointed a delegate to the Continental Congress. When he was re-elected for a second term in November 1783, he was chosen by his fellow delegates to serve as president of the Confederation Congress. One of his first duties as president was, in a twist of irony, to accept the resignation of George Washington as commander-in-chief. After Washington handed him his official resignation on December 23, 1783, Mifflin, always the orator, thanked Washington on behalf of Congress. You retire from the theater of action with the blessings of your fellow citizens, but the glory of your virtues will not terminate with your military command. It will continue to resonate throughout the ages. Whatever the nature of their animosities during the war, Mifflin and Washington quickly buried the hatchet. In later life, Mifflin would be a frequent guest at Mount Vernon. The Confederation Congress quickly lost whatever vestiges of power it retained once peace came. It took Mifflin several months to gather enough representatives to ratify their victory over the British. After his term as president of the Confederation Congress, Mifflin was elected to the Pennsylvania General Assembly from 1785 to 1788. For the first 3 years, he was the Speaker. He also found time to attend the Constitutional Convention in 1787, though he gave no speeches, served on no committees, and requested only one motion. I couldn't even find any record of what that motion exactly was. He would ultimately sign the document and make sure Pennsylvania did as well. His term in the General Assembly completed, he was duly appointed as President of the Supreme Executive Council of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania on November 5, 1788. He oversaw the committee that rewrote the Pennsylvania Constitution, creating the democratically elected office of governor. He would serve as governor, too, until he left office on December 17, 1799. During his first term as governor, he cooperated with now President George Washington to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. He ran for and was elected to the General Assembly after stepping down as governor. As fate would have it, he suddenly fell ill on January 14, 1800, and died just 6 days later, on January 20, 1800, at the age of 56. While the political and military career of Thomas Mifflin certainly had its ups and downs, we tried to pay special attention to his actions as quartermaster, so that's what we will reflect on in this conclusion. Though he was perhaps an excellent merchant and a decent quartermaster, Mifflin had no qualms about abusing his power to enrich his business partners and friends, no doubt expecting it would pay dividends after he left the service. Military spending is essential to maintaining a strong and secure nation, but we need to remain mindful not only of the price tag, but also of who is in control of where and how the money is spent. When we grant one person or a small group of people command over the vast sinews of war, we must ensure that they act according to the public good and not to the betterment of themselves or their business partners. Thomas Mifflin's story provides a good lesson in this regard. I hope you found this video both informative and exciting. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. Join us next time as we look at our next forgotten figure, the semi-mythical story of Molly Pitcher, who took her fallen husband's spot on the battlefield, manning a cannon at the Battle of Monmouth.